Welcome to the Connected Campus podcast, where we explore the ways that diverse professionals are working every day to optimize their efforts to recruit, retain, and graduate their students.
Our conversation today will be an interesting one where, building upon the previous cross-posted episode with our guests, our fearless CEO, Chase. So we're going to be looking a little bit more towards the past to inform us about the current moment and really zeroing in on the higher ed tech sort of ecosystem, higher ed at large, and sort of how technology is interplaying with sort of the issues of the day. So just in case folks aren't acquainted, though, Chase, if you want to give sort of the quick Twitter bio version of who you are, what you do at Pathify, and those sort of things, and then we'll get into the rest of the discussion.
Sure, yeah, happy to be back and for the first time on our podcast. So my name is Chase Wiliams, as you said. I'm one of the founders of Pathify and our CEO. I founded the company with James McCubbin over 10 years ago now, down in Australia, and we moved the company to the US in 2017, and have just been primarily focused on replacing pretty outdated web portal technology and now becoming quite dated mobile app technology with one combined front-end hub, essentially, that connects with all of an institution's systems and resources and content and people and brings all of that into one cohesive place for the end user and primarily the student. So happy to be joining you in that capacity today and have a bit of a conversation about how we got here and what led us to solving this kind of problem in higher education.
Yeah, and I think you'll hold that distinction. The first repeat guest, and I guess there could be technicalities, so I'm sure you'll come back another time to be like, the first repeat of Connected Campus. But yeah, I mean, I'm really excited because I think always getting somebody, a lot of our guests there are, CIOs or other folks that are sort of, looking out at sort of the whole space. So it's always just good, even as much as we sort of look at the current moment or look towards the future, which we did a little bit more in the previous episode, like looking towards the past of sort of the cause and effect that led us to this moment, as much as we're sort of just like kind of pontificating wildly about like what could be or what might happen and all that. We can kind of really say like these are sort of the the sort of the dominoes that fell that led us to now, which we kind of have to grapple with in reality versus any sort of possible futures and such. So as you see it, like what are some of the events or just sort of kind of cultural things of like the higher ed ecosystem that led us to this current moment where we are kind of from the tech perspective? Because I feel like, like looking back 20 years, and I think that's why, like, the work that you're doing, you're kind of explaining like so much has been changing so quick over the past 2 decades and, many decades prior and everything. But from your perspective, what are some of those kind of key moments or key changes in the higher ed world?
Yeah, and I think it was a lot of them to things that happened in tech that have impacted higher ed. But I mean, I think back to when I was at Monash, we had a web portal that was built in 1998 called My Monash. So you had around the .com boom and consumer or business web interfaces coming into play, and portals being built at that time. Really, it wasn't too long after that, if we think about it, that MySpace was out and Facebook, which was squarely focused on universities and colleges, obviously, 2004, huge moment, and has had a major impact on how we expect to connect with one another digitally. The iPhone was another pretty big moment. And it was around that time, I mean, this had been happening previously in terms of technologies that were connecting information and data between systems in a integrated middleware kind of way. But really around the time of the iPhone or 2010s, early 2010s, you started to see enterprise integration as a service platform starting to come out then, and that they're having a major impact in higher education, given how many systems we now have. Then really, like on the financial tech side, there was probably in large part due to Facebook and the popularity that had in our culture, particularly in the US, in Western countries, around the VC backing and the story and all of the kinds of things that went with that, that just led to an explosion too in VC backed companies and VC backed EdTech. And I was reading a study a few years ago, and even preparing for our fall summit last year, I read this study again by Navitas, which said there was something like 15,000 EdTech companies now as of like 2019. There's probably more now, but I'd imagine it's sort of the rate of growth has dwindled pretty significantly, obviously the last year or so. But that was in 2018-19, and no one had seen COVID coming yet, which would have led to another explosion. So there was that, and then obviously COVID and the funding that came out of that. So it's kind of these crucial events that have happened over the last 20 years that I think we can kind of dig into during this podcast to describe how has each of those pretty specifically impacted what we're doing with our platform. Because I think each of those is like an event at a point in time, but many of which have had like continued impacts and still do today, have led to how we look at our platform and things like design and connecting people on the platform, how we look at integration, how we look at configurability, extensibility of the platform. All those things are really factored and have grown out of those events that I just mentioned at a high level.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what's always like wild to think about is like, oh yeah, like those are all things that have happened in the past 20 so year, like, and they've all sort of compounded with each other of like, okay, the social internet continues to be with us as it sort of, morphs and changes in terms of like what's the hot app or whatever else. But then like the idea of people now connecting onto those platforms primarily through mobile devices, and then like certainly just like disruptions of the pandemic and just how people live and kind of live, work, study, and all those sort of things. But then like something else that I was thinking of, and maybe if you want to kind of speak to this as maybe sort of the first part of how we sort of break down how these events are sort of kind of creating sort of the issues and the problems and things that institutions are grappling with. But like technology is also just like getting cheaper, and that sort of I think is that driver of like all these technology companies that are also just sort of like it's software as a service, or just with the prevalence of like the hardware, much of which is like mobile devices, but it could be any number of other things, and just like computing power, and just we're just possible, like so many more things are possible now that would have been sort of a dream, the onset of the .com era of just sort of creating those simple portals and things. So I think but I guess take it as you will, whatever is sort of like top of mind of like all the sort of context of the history that we're laying out that leads us to this current moment. How, like, what are the issues that are coming up that institutions are having to deal with from all those events?
Yeah, there's a few big ones for us. I mean, the one that I think people think of most as relates to us, particularly because we have like a Flow middleware platform that sits behind our front end Pathify, is that this explosion in EdTech. And now I've got, as a CIO at an institution, I've got software that I purchased that came through IT, but then there's so much software that was purchased over in academic affairs, or maybe there's been software that's purchased down in student life or over in student life that I may not be aware of, or has extended the IT budget. And even as like the lens and funding continues to be dynamic at the state level, like trying to plan for all of those things, I think we're going to see a situation where using a platform like ours to tie all of those systems together into one coordinated place and really amplify the purchases or investments you've made, and then probably some culling of nice to have platforms that didn't come through central IT or need to argue to be part of the central and cohesive system, I could see happening as well. But wherever an institution ends up, and usually the bigger the institution, the more systems and the more unique cases they're serving, or use cases they're serving. So having that kind of cohesive system to bring all of that together in order to, like the term we choose to use on the marketing side and the sales side, is like amplify your existing investments. Because you might have 100 or 200 tools that you've purchased across the institution, and having them down in a place where no one's seeing them, like collecting dust, doesn't really help anyone. So that's one of the big pieces we look at. So more ROI on your ecosystem as a CIO. I think what COVID did most relevant to us, I think, is act as a catalyst for the realization that we actually need a hybrid experience here. We need both a physical campus experience if we're going to bring people back to campus and we're not just a digital or an online institution. And in addition to that physical campus experience, in order to create a hybrid one, we need a digital campus experience as well. And part of that is risk mitigation in the event something like that happens again, and having something more robust that goes beyond just Zoom and the LMS, essentially. And having a platform that people, students in particular, but also prospects and alumni and others can connect on when they aren't coming to campus as much. So I think it acts as a catalyst for that realization that the expectation now for students, particularly now they've been shown that the digital side of the institution and the online education delivery, there's just an expectation out there that they have a digital campus as well as a physical one. So there's two, I think, that are pretty big ones.
Yeah, and I think just sort of building on that too, like the sort of like student expectations, because like sort of the hybrid institution, or I think people see I'll be writing about kind of like digital first sort of mindset coming in institutions and everything, where it's kind of it needs to be assumed, or it's kind of increasingly assumed, that sort of like digital infrastructure, one that's sort of like the back end, like you said, sort of bringing all these things together, making the work better together, but then like that they sort of have this sort of augmentation, or any of these sort of action words that are sort of supplementing that on ground experience that can make connections between students and just help the sort of business of the institution run more efficiently. But the other thing that, though, has kind of come up a lot too, and was sort of one of the earlier points you made, is there's sort of just like an end of the life cycle of some of these tools that maybe were like inaugurated in the early 2000s that institutions were using, where it's like, the expectations of students with like user interface and just sort of, all these sort of things has changed so dramatically, because there's so many other apps that they're using on a daily basis, and they're constantly, utilizing a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, like, and so like, then they would come to their institution at a place when they're investing a lot of time and money and everything. And if they're not sort of getting a user experience that is at least close to, or, near what they're getting in the rest of their life, like that's something that I think institutions are kind of grappling with, like getting feedback or anything, where they're like, well, how can we try to elevate what we're doing? So I guess just any thoughts about that, of just like that being a problem, because I think part of it is just the sort of the life cycle of technology, like certain investments that institutions have made are just kind of reaching their natural sort of end.
Yeah, I think that one's always baffled me a little bit, being in higher ed the last 10 or more years now, is that I feel as though design, both UI and UX, if I was a CIO, that would play a relatively material component in the evaluation process for me of any tool. We know that if I'm at an institution where most students are between the age of 18 and 25, let's say, I know that they are using consumer grade tools every day and getting an experience where the company that is behind the application they're using is a direct to consumer or a B2C application, and they don't get anywhere. They're not selling to someone in the middle who's making a decision on behalf of the user. The user is making the decision, and therefore they have to be world leading effectively in user experience, or people just won't come back. It's as simple as that. And why that lens, it's understandable why the lens isn't applied as much as you would in the consumer scenario, because someone is purchasing on behalf of someone else. But it feels like such an easy win compared to some of the other more like functional wins and like large pieces of like large modules or um, really specific use cases or whatever it may be that you might be looking for in a software. Um, to have a software that just provides an uplift and provides a modern experience that meets expectations, it feels like one of the easiest wins you can get when
Mm-hmm.
looking at new software or replacing software or making a software decision. Um, because first impressions matter, or impression like on the surface impressions do matter as much as we don't want to say don't judge a book by its cover. People tend to. It's just like having a car that's you haven't taken for a wash recently, and then you run it through the car wash, and even you as the owner who's seen the car 1,000 times are kind of like, oh, this looks pretty good. I mean, this doesn't look too bad. So
Yeah.
it's just that kind of thing where it seems like an easy win and doesn't factor in as much as I thought it would, but I think it is factoring more and more. The more institutions are bringing students into the decision making process, which they are, we're seeing that. The more I think that will happen.
Yeah. Well, on that just sort of like metaphor, which again, anybody who's listened to me here or anywhere else, love a good metaphor, is like, and I guess this is a very like smaller sort of like pivot for like a metaphor, but with like my smartphone, when like a new, operating system comes out, it's like, oh, I feel like I've got a whole new phone. And it's just an idea of like, it's still the same thing. It's still just like what it is, but like the interface is just like, oh, the colors are more vibrant, the fonts are like, and it's like that sort of feeling, like kind of that emotional side of it. But then there's like just the human nature thing of like, if you're hitting those friction points where it's just like anybody just knows those times when they've been able to just like smoothly do something, and like, and especially like buying things, like if it's super easy to buy something, you're just gonna like impulsively go with it, whatever. But if you're like sort of hitting a bunch of roadblocks and friction and everything else, and yeah, you're just gonna bail out. And I think it is something where, yeah, institutions have become more and more aware of how important that is, even though I think more of the focus, just like you said, like, and you can understand why a CIO their thinking would start here, and that's why like acknowledging their blind spots and maybe bringing in a student has become increasingly common, which is great.
Mhm.
But like they're thinking about that sort of interoperability, like how does this fit in with everything else, or anything like that. And I think I just want to sort of capture it here because I'm going to kind of try to weave in the other sort of things that we wanted to cover here. But like you're saying, like it can allow, if you can sort of have something that allows that front facing uh experience to just be better, you just are sort of plugging in what you already have. And I think I'm curious, maybe just sort of the experience or sort of reflections you have of like, there's maybe a fork in the road at some point, or there's been several forks of like, you know and there's other companies that are doing this, and more power to them, but like it's been refreshing the level of like focus where it's like, well, we could just build the one thing that does everything better, right? Like, it brings sort of the ethos, but then it becomes this sort of behemoth, or sort of like, well, it's a communications tool, it's a student information system, it's everything. And it's like, well, you could just make everything else work better together versus it being the one thing that is everything and all that. So I think just like speaking of that, of like how we're working to solve these problems, is that sort of like interoperability, and why that is sort of where you had kind of historically landed. And I think you've sort of like talked around it a little bit. I kind of just like want to sort of sit with that for a little bit of just why that sort of back end middleware, flow and everything seems like it's just sort of like the better bet, especially just like looking at sort of the reality of sort of this current moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's even why companies, as they get bigger, they'll buy instead of build as well. Like even if you're looking at like a private equity roll up, they'll go out and pluck companies and sort of try to mesh them together, and it doesn't always work. But it's very difficult to fund a company, particularly from inception, that's going to go down every rabbit hole. You'll find yourself with technical debt and out of resources extremely quickly, and you'll probably have customer service or a customer service experience that's significantly lacking because you'll be spread so thin across so many different use cases and platforms that it becomes really difficult. I mean, it's something we need to think about constantly from a product perspective, is how thinly are we spreading ourselves How deep do we take on any given function natively within the platform? And how deep does an integration go before we send the user to a specific point solution that gets the use case and the job done better than we ever would without significant investment anyway? So we can kind of build in, a lot of the data we're pulling into the front end is read-only data that's surfacing information from other places. We're playing more and more in the taking an action from the widget that ties into a specific system within our platform at a shallow level that can then send data back to the source system. But largely this will be about how can we give you windows into different systems, into different use cases, into different pieces of information that you need, and then allow you to act on it in the point solution should you wish to. And I think just practically, that is going to be the best way to solve the problem for a good number of years until, for whatever reason, maybe AI, building things becomes so inexpensive that you kind of can take everything on from the ground up and make it happen. But I just don't see that happening for some time. But
yeah, well, and I feel like it wouldn't be a higher ed EdTech podcast without a little tease of AI, and that's sort of something that is going to be, if we do this, same sort of thing, and the next handful of years, looking back, it'd be like, oh, remember when AI just sort of hit the scene, and we're all just sort of like grappling with it and kind of figuring out how to integrate it and everything. And yeah, I think that'll be really, really fascinating to see is sort of how that kind of changes the dynamic of how. Any organization is just deploying the limited resources and stuff like that. But yeah, and I think it makes so much sense of just sort of that. Yeah, at the very least, the foundation, the V1 is like, okay, just like the read only stuff, so you kind of know how to sort of when you log into the system, okay, here's sort of the summary of what's going on in the LMS and the SIS and anywhere else. You're kind of getting just all these sort of kind of indicators of that important information, and then you can kind of start to stack upon that of like kind of more and more depth of functionality. And I guess I almost want to ask this in like kind of an emotional way, because I think we've laid out a lot here of this current moment and how we're sort of working with it and working with institutions, like that kind of like almost like emotional resonance or something, like because I know, and I've kind of shared this anecdote several times, but like, I stumbled upon Pathify, a booth at South by in 2021, and it just clicked. It just made a lot of sense. Like that sort of resonance was just there almost immediately with just kind of the elevator pitch and getting kind of just a quick glimpse. So I guess like any anecdotes or reflections from your perspective of just like how Pathify has been resonating, just as we're sort of talking about these issues and how we're choosing to kind of help institutions kind of grapple and interface with them, like how has that been sort of resonating, like the sort of feelings that you're getting from institutional leaders?
I mean, it's pretty positive, particularly when you're speaking at a very conceptual level, in terms of the problem we're tackling, both just stitching an experience together that, I mean, I can't tell you how many times as a student at the institutions I attended, and I know this is a problem that everyone has had, where I'd be doing my timetable for classes, and then I'd be enrolling in courses, and like they would be two totally different systems. And that's not something necessarily we're going to fix, but there were just so many of these moments where I'd be jumping through hoops and like having to work the UX out for myself. And it really didn't feel like we should need to do that. And certainly, and that was in 2008, 2009, 2010, that sort of in that time period. And more and more today, particularly with what we're doing with our middleware, like it's anywhere there's friction in that experience, that's where I'm looking to have us lean in and just help make college a very, very seamless experience for the end user. And I think that's what resonates, because institutions know, I mean, they've been around for dozens of years, some hundreds of years. They know that they've collected tech and effectively tech debt along with it, like UX debt along with it over the last few years and decades, and that they know that side of things can be cleaned up. So it's that just certainly resonates anytime we're speaking to a CIO. And often when a CIO comes in to a new institution, that's the kind of thing they're looking to replace, right? Is like, how can I better organize our tech stack? How can I better organize our architecture? And we're giving them a user experience side to that question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's how it's resonating, I suppose, certainly at the executive level.
Yeah. Well, and something like a funny thing I just thought of is like that there's probably an increasing reality of that, like people that we're talking to that are in sort of decision making sort of positions probably have either studied themselves or maybe like, they're like 1 degree removed, like, their children are in college right now or something. Like there's just sort of like so much more of where like kind of the zeitgeist, the norm, sort of just the feeling in the air is just so visceral of just sort of like and I mean this in the best way, is that idea where like we can easily be like, has this ever happened to you? Like, have you ever been trying to find like what like, and whenever you can just kind of pull on that thread and it just, people are like, oh my God, yeah, like, and just kind of have that initial sort of emotional pull. And then obviously like you've got to sort of have sort of the substance to back up that sizzle, but like that idea that like we can kind of be teed up to at least kind of start talking in a place where there's sort of that immediate kind of resonance of either you or somebody you care about or students you work with, you are getting that either firsthand or just 1 degree removed and everything. So yeah, I think it's just, I've experienced that, and certainly even just you for yourself, where it's just like, yeah, like I'm always just scratching my own itch. Like I don't want anybody to have to like feel the way that I felt of having to like have multiple like browser windows open, and even then it's like you're just like pushing against the grain and you're able to kind of like push through and get to where you're going. But
Yeah, I mean that's what I mean by it resonates at the conceptual level, and what you said there about you need to have the substance to back it up. That's where it gets more interesting, and you get into the weeds. And I think that's where we resonate with the web developers, the director of IT applications, or director of enterprise applications within the IT office. Once they sort of start to peek under the hood and can see, okay, you're telling us about a big problem. You're telling us about a problem we know we have. We get it. How are you actually solving this? And when we bring in, the front end's mobile app, web backed by an integration layer, we've already integrated with all of your popular higher ed systems that you've got in your ecosystem. Take a look at exactly how we go about doing that. Wow, okay, yeah, we do integrate with 15 of the 40 student-facing systems you already have, and we're expanding that every day. We start to get under that, and the resonance at that level starts to come in as well. I was at a conference just last week. I won't name the person now, but I will be reaching out to them. I reached out to them last week to start a conversation with their institution. But I was having lunch with them, and they were saying GPT and LLMs came up, and they were sort of describing, the company that really figures out how to stitch systems together within our ecosystem and present that in a cohesive way into like a front end for the student. That's what we really need these days. Like that's what we're all grappling with. These institutions and all the IT people that are at this particular conference. That's the kind of thing we're grappling with. And like, I was trying to get a word in as he was describing it, and eventually he got to the end, and I said, I'm Chase. That's literally exactly what we do, and this is why. And there was also a GPT and LLM component to it around, how can that technology be either plugged in or natively added to our platform to do the other side of the information architecture, in the sense that, yes, our platform brings all of this information together and then nudges a student towards it. But what about if a student comes to our platform with a question? We're not great at answering that right now, or we're not great at meeting that need right now. So he was also talking about that particular use case, and I described like some of the research we're doing there and what we might be thinking about in that sense. But it was just interesting to hear someone at the level that this person was describing these are the kinds of conversations we're having at this conference. This is what would be really useful, and just sort of letting him get to the end of what he needed and sort of describing that's what we do. We're having more and more conversations like that. The further down the path we get, the more and more systems will be implemented at an institution, or the more difficult it will be to stop implementing, I think, more systems as technology comes out and gets cheaper, and the need for a cohesive front end will just naturally grow. So I see us well positioned in that sense.
Yeah. And again, just biting your tongue until they're done talking, where you just want to be that's what we do. That's a great kind of anecdote, because I think getting out to conferences and stuff too, just when especially I was at one where the entire sort of session topics and everything that's going on is very curated. So I was seeing just the way that people were talking about things with the sort of the digital first, or certain terms where it's I know I must have heard them somewhere, but it's that's just always what's kind of pinging around in my mind, and just seeing it reflected back at me, just sort of independently. This is what people who are sort of observing the whole sort of landscape chose to say, okay, we've only got so many slots, but we're talking about this. We're talking about high tech, high touch. We're talking all these sort of little turns of phrases or sort of perspectives and stuff. So that was just really refreshing. It's that idea of sort of the resonance. And then even just sort of the last question, I guess, is just if there's any other anecdotes, but I think it's really great. The one that already that you shared is that kind of almost whoever we talk to, or whoever sort of sees this, kind of just gets it, or it sort of can kind of scratch their itch, whatever that itch may be, where sometimes it's oh, we always have to kind of just find our way and get our foot into this one place because that's the only person who kind of gets what we're doing, or something. There's so many different layers, or sort of things. So I guess just as sort of a final thought, kind of the differentiation, or sort of kind of how what we're doing is differentiating from the rest of the market, as we're sort of, I guess, leaving this episode, going out into the future from where we are. Just any final thoughts on that point?
I think the biggest differentiator for us is that we're looking to bring the entire digital universe together at an institution. So not just the information occurring across the systems in a CIO or school's ecosystem, but the content that they have laying around everywhere, the resources, files, links, videos that they've got laying around everywhere, the support services, advisors, etc. Making connection to all of that simpler and literally at your fingertips, as they say, is a big part of what we're doing. And portals in the past and other platforms in the market tend to be focused more so on just the system level and the information level, not bringing together people and support and that sort of thing. And some aren't even looking at resources and content pages and things like that. So just we're looking to tie it all together in a really personalized way. That's the first piece. And then when it does come to systems and the information that resides in those systems, or the activity that's occurring in them, we're totally tool agnostic. And we're not owned by a private equity company that's part of a larger roll-up. We're not owned by another company in the space. We're our own company, which is independent of every other system in higher ed. And that means you don't have to worry about which SIS you're using, or which LMS you're using, or which CRM. You can add and swap out and kind of, as the CIO, build the tech stack of your dreams, or build the tech stack that you want to build, and not have to worry about your front end changing. I mean, if you're with a particular SIS right now, and that SIS, and this goes for any of them, and that SIS has a front end or has a portal, and you're looking to switch SIS, well, now you're switching your portal or your front end at the same time. So just that independence, and what comes from that independence is also our ability to integrate with any system across the space as well. We're not focusing on a specific set of systems that our company owns or our company is aligned to, where we just look at the space, we pick the most popular tools across the ecosystem, and we go after those in order to have the highest bang for buck when we go and talk to the next CIO and what they're looking at. The more we can turn up and they look at our integrations and say, wow, you've already integrated with 20 of the systems we use here. That's going to pique some interest and raise some eyebrows in a good way.
Yeah. And something that I had a pretty clear thought about that feels really relevant here with like everything you're talking about as a, kind of final thought to try to wrap everything up here is like, you could have all these sort of amazing tools and platforms that you're using. But like half the battle is like the delivery, like how you're bringing them to people and that user experience and just like communicating, the things that a student or any sort of stakeholder needs to do. So like, it makes me think of just sort of this like huge, like powerful kind of like Voltron, kind of robot or something that's just sort of clunkily going on. It's like, yeah, you want something that feels like more nimble and flexible and sort of like flowing and all that, because it's like, it's getting nowhere fast, just sort of lumbering around or whatever. Cause it's like, well, we bought all these like amazing things, but it's like, you got to think about how you're sort of presenting all these resources, all these tools, all these things, because, you kind of were saying this earlier of like, they're all sort of just gathering dust or sort of neglected and just sort of sitting around. And it's like, everybody loses. Like, you're wasting money on something that like, is not realizing its potential. And then like students or whomever else are like, aren't utilizing the platform that is going to help them navigate the complex, campus that is sort of just how things are nowadays. Like, they're just like little cities that have all these sort of different things that are built and made and sort of hoping to connect and engage with the students that need what they're providing. So I leave that as the last word for folks to sit with and kind of think about how they're sort of addressing that. But yeah, I mean, it's been a few months since we had talked before. I imagine we'll probably be doing this again in a couple of months, and we'll see where the world is at. But yeah, just always appreciate your time and your perspective.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to The Connected Campus. Please leave a 5-star review for the show and share it so others can discover us. Make sure to also subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode of The Connected Campus.